Hey everybody, welcome back to the Nyedis Anarchy series. I'm your host Adam, the CIO of Nyedis, and today we're going to talk about security bloat. So this was a term that I feel like I just coined out of nowhere while talking with a buddy of mine about various security protocols and how to kind of lock down environments in the cloud and stuff. And we're saying like, hey, should we do this? Should you do that? You know, all kinds of like, what are best practices and that kind of stuff. And it just came to a point where I was like, man, you know, if you could do all this stuff, sure, but you're just adding so much security bloat to it. And he was like, what is that? And I was like, it's just a term I just kind of made up on top of my head. And basically the idea is like when you add so much security to your infrastructure that you're not really reducing risk anymore. And instead, you're actually just adding more complexity and more real risk of actual problems going on or issues in your infrastructure. And I think this is something that is not really talked about too much, which is how much security is too much security. And that's kind of where this whole security bloat kind of idea comes from, right? Because just because you can add in all this stuff doesn't mean you necessarily need to do it. Like, let's say you're using SSL termination, right? Like at the load balancer or at the proxy level. So you have your internet coming in, everything's all over SSL and everything's secured. But then at that point, you're saying, hey, we're going to terminate our SSL and everything inside our VPC is going to be all just using regular HTTP clear text communication between all your servers or clusters or whatever else you got going on. So at this point, that's when people will say like, oh, well, now we need to lock this down. So let's do SSL between this server to this server inside the VPC. And then let's do some type of a authentication, RBAC authentication, or let's do some other form of authentication between this server and this server on top of SSL. And let's make sure that these secrets rotate on top of whatever. And it's like, okay, you can absolutely do all that, and depending on how secure these systems need to be, maybe that's mandatory. But realistically, how much security is too much security? Because I've had points where, it's like I'll just say, hey, if you have this server on your app layer, and these two servers within the app layer behind all of your corporate firewalls in your data center want to talk to each other, they should be over SSL, so this way you don't have people sniffing the traffic. And, I get, most of the time I get pushback for saying, nope, we're terminating SSL at the web layer. The F5 is going to kill SSL. Everything inside is clear text. It's fine because it's all internal. That's where I argue, well, it's not really fine. I think you really should have the SSL. But at that point in time for them, they consider that security bloat. They consider that to be overhead that's not necessary. It doesn't reduce the amount of risk for the benefit that it offers. So this is a whole new idea that I'm now approaching when I'm ever doing any type of architecture or, even looking at vendors and what their security infrastructure is, or how does a third-party product integrate, what's the best way to minimize security bloat? Because I think this is a real concern for some more on the engineer side, not necessarily on the higher like CISO level, right? Because engineers want to kind of over-engineer everything. They want to make it as efficient and secure as possible, but in the grand scheme of things, it might not be necessary. Because if you're a application developer and you're working on your particular server and you're trying to secure the shit out of that thing, that's great, but it might not be necessary to put that much time and effort into securing that particular box or that particular piece of communication that you're doing, because overarching, you might have security policies in place that are preventing any malicious traffic from getting in there. And at one point, you have to say like, hey, when is this just too much security, and how much is considered like just overhead, right? Because at some point you have to say, hey, if someone actually gets to this box where I'm trying to, protect the traffic and make it not clear text, they already own the infrastructure. They're already at root level ownership of another server, or they're already within the VPC, or at that point they own the Terraform scripts that are pushing, services up into the cloud, because you don't even allow manual cloud changes. So if they already have that, not really, if it's cloud, it's not really physical access, but I think what I'm talking about, right? Like if they have that physical access where they own that network at that point, it doesn't matter if you've locked down the security, the traffic between two boxes, because they could just do whatever they want with that box anyway, right? It's kind of like the whole, like the Mac, like a MacBook Pro or Mac's OS in general. If you forget your admin password, it's like, oh, well, I have everything locked down, I'm safe. Well, if someone has access to your physical machine, then it doesn't matter what security processes you put in place. So that's why a lot of times, like my password on my personal MacBook is very weak. It's super weak. And it's like, my wife even asked me when she asked me what my password was because she needed to do something. I told her, and she's like, what? She's like, you're Mr. Security Guy and you have this as your password? It's like, yeah. Because if you have my machine in hand, you can just boot into, the the restore mode into the Mac, and then just change the admin password, and then log in as me, and then tell you have access to everything. So why go through all this crazy complex password for a local login that you need to have physical access to the machine for? Doesn't make any sense. I could do that, but that's going to be a pain in the ass to type in all the time. If I have to tell it to someone for whatever reason, like my wife, because she needs to get onto something, she won't be able to, because we're never going to be able to explain it all. So it's like, security bloat is a real thing. I would love to hear from you guys how this is affecting you in your networks, because I'm sure it is. Like, this is a kind of a new term, and I'd love to hear how other people are facing this issue and probably just didn't have a term wrapped around it. Because I think this is something that we definitely over-engineer. I know I'm absolutely responsible for it as well. I've definitely gone above and beyond in trying to lock systems down when, it's pure, overhead and not necessary. When you're connecting to these servers and you're adding all these security processes in place, right? Every single security thing that you put in place increases your latency and increases something to go wrong. So everything wants to be fast and you want everything to work. So is that security benefit actually beneficial, or is it just going to introduce risk from the other end? I kind of view this as like the conundrum of zipping a zip file. Like when you try to compress something that's already compressed, it gets bigger. So when you try to secure something that's overly secure, you're just going to make that risk larger in the sense that something could fail. Sure, no one's going to break in, but the server will go down because you forgot that you had this other thing in place and you didn't update the certificate or something, right? So how much security is too much security to where the actual security you're putting in place becomes the risk itself and is not necessary to be put in there? I think that's kind of the synopsis of what I believe security bloat is. So how is security bloat impacting your environment? I'd love to hear it, because I think this is something that we all face and we never really talk about. So that's it. That's my idea on security bloat. Hit me up on Twitter, Spotify, TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, LinkedIn, all the social media stuff. We are at Nyedis IAM, which is Nyedis IAM. And you can hit me up directly if you don't even want to talk publicly. You can hit me up on email, adam@nyedis.com, Nyedis.com. See you guys around. Later.